You are listening to the podcast of the Mathias Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors, external contributors, and students, look up our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.
Dear listeners, today we are going to talk about the legal aspects and possible political consequences and implications of Ukraine's fast-track EU membership request. We have the pleasure to have Mr. Rodrigo Ballester with us, who serves as head of the Center for European Studies at Mathias Corvinus Collegium. Rodrigo, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Good morning. Jó reggelt and köszönöm szépen. Very happy to be here.
My name is Bálint Tóth from the MCC Center for Political Science. First, let me just very quickly tell the audience the basic story in a nutshell. On the 28th of February, 4 days after Russian forces attacked Ukraine, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky presented an official appeal to the EU for immediate membership under a special fast-track protocol, while his country is resolutely defending itself against a Russian invasion. Europeans are witnessing how our soldiers are fighting not only for our country, but for all of Europe, for peace, for all the countries in the European Union, Zelensky said. Our goal is to be together with all Europeans, and most importantly, to be on an equal footing. I am sure we deserved it, he added. Shortly after, Ukraine's ambassador to the EU handed over his country's application. On the same day, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stated that Ukraine belongs in the EU and that the group wants it to join. They are one of us, and we want them in, von der Leyen told media, emphasizing the already existent lively EU-Ukraine cooperation. However, unlike the Western Balkan nations, who have been granted a clear path to EU membership many years ago, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, all of which aspire to EU membership, have not received such assurances so far. Additionally, EU officials appear to be split on the speed with which Kyiv endeavors to join the EU family. We are going to address this aspect later on. So, aspirants to join the EU often face a lengthy and complicated procedure that normally necessitates considerable reforms. In the case of Hungary, there was a 10-year period between the submission of the application for accession and the actual admission. And prior to Hungary's accession, the then Hungarian government had to agree with neighboring countries that they had no territorial disputes whatsoever. However, Slovenia's Prime Minister Janez Janša called the current accession criteria outdated given the circumstances. So, Rodrigo, you have a robust legal background and many years of experience in European affairs. How do you see, is there any legal basis for Ukraine's fast-track EU accession?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much. Very good question to start. I mean, legal basis, yes, you have it in the treaty. And at the end, it's a procedure that gives a lot of margin of maneuver for the member states and to decide, for the European Union to decide in general. Some accessions went very, very quickly. Think about Austria and Sweden, for example, and some others took a very, very long time. And so the steps are pretty clear, and according to the political will, they could go, in theory, quicker, or they could also be slower. But we have to be extremely prudent there, because first, from a legal point of view, here is really the kingdom of unanimity. Enlargement is really one policy where everything is decided by unanimity. Whether you grant a candidate status or not, this is unanimity. Whether you start the negotiations, also by unanimity. The mandate of the Commission to negotiate, also unanimity, and also to finally agree on the agreement. And then also, by the way, it also must be ratified by the European Parliament, and in some cases also by the national parliaments. So it's a very long and arduous process. And don't forget neither that now it was made much more complicated since 2019. Because in 2019 there was a huge enlargement crisis because France actually behaving as the spokesman of other countries that didn't dare to speak so openly. But France blocked the starting of the negotiations with Albania and Macedonia. And on that basis, the Commission, drafted a new methodology and beginning of 2020. And this new methodology makes it even more complicated. So now the question is, we give now a fast track to Ukraine, where actually some other countries like Serbia, Montenegro, Macedonia, Albania have been waiting for years and years and years. I mean, just bear in mind that, for example, the negotiations with Montenegro started 10 years ago. It has been a candidate country since 2006, if I'm not mistaken. No, since 2010. And now Ukraine, just because it's in a very dire situation now, will get the privilege of joining the European Union within months or even within years. No, that's not realistic. But what is actually realistic is maybe to speed up some of the steps. Could, for example, Ukraine become a candidate country very quickly? That's something that is definitely on the table. But again, then the process of joining the European Union will be very, very long. But the perspective of Ukraine becoming, of giving them like the hope that one day they will be, which is concretely becoming a candidate country, that could happen actually quicker than we think, and actually it could be quicker than usual. But again, we need unanimity, and we have also a lot of European member states to convince on that.
Yeah, and you mentioned those Western Balkan states. Turkey, Serbia, North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Albania are currently contenders for membership, as you put it. The EU's relations with the Western Balkan countries take place within a special framework, legal framework, let's call it like this, called the Stabilization and Association Process. Well, how do you see, could Ukraine's step affect the Western Balkan states' EU accession process?
That's a $1 million question, and even let me be more precise: will it affect it negatively or positively? Both theories are now possible. Imagine that the first one will be that we need to give priority for Ukraine, so we will have Macedonia, Albania, Montenegro, and Serbia waiting. Another option is that, look, if they join while the others have been waiting for much longer time, then maybe it makes more sense to do them all together. But again, it all depends also on the final outcome of the war. What's going to happen? If the war is going to last for years, it's going to last for months. No one knows at this stage. And this is also very important, because once the war, will be over, or at least under control, the appetite for enlargement, especially in Western Europe, will decrease and dwindle, very much so. I mean, you have countries that really are not ready at all to enlarge the European Union. France was the spokesman of them, but think about the Netherlands, for example. Think about Denmark. Remember that in the Netherlands already blocked Ukraine in a national referendum. And they blocked it basically for a minor issue. So again, once, the emotion and also the geopolitical situation will be under control, I guess they are the way for all those candidate countries, especially for Ukraine, will be more complicated. I mean, the conditions to negotiate an accession are very complicated. We are here speaking about 35 chapters, about really very deep judicial reforms, economic reforms, political reforms. Those things cannot not be done quickly, and Ukraine is in a very complicated situation. So again, I think that to give Ukraine a European perspective is something that is legally and politically possible. But again, between that and being an EU member state, you have different stages, you have different shades of gray, so to speak. And there are also other alternative solutions that could be offered to Ukraine.
I understand. And as you mentioned, so despite the growing enthusiasm among a large number of member states towards Ukraine's fast-track application, EU officials appear divided.
Officials and member states.
And even the member states, heads of states and heads of government appear divided about the the speed, the pace with which Ukraine's EU aspirations can be realized. For instance, European Council President Charles Michel admitted there were different opinions and sensitivities within the EU on the enlargement, as you mentioned, this 2019 French declaration, admitting that Ukraine is part of the European House, German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock stressed that joining the EU is not something that can be done in a few months.
Mm-hmm. She's right.
Yeah, absolutely. We experienced it. It involves an intensive and far-reaching transformation, as you mentioned. Member states can make the decision on the official status of membership, which must be unanimous. Again, you stressed it earlier. For instance, despite the fact that thanks to the Slovenian presidency, the accession process of Western Balkan states to the EU was brought back to the agenda last year, the enlargement prospects of the region still remains uncertain, as many countries, not just France, but even Bulgaria is blocking the opening of the negotiations with North Macedonia. And given the changed geopolitical situation, do you believe that, for instance, Paris or any other big member state might be persuaded to give at least a silent consent to the southeastern and eastern enlargement of the EU?
I have doubts. About it because, again, the war obliges you to be more open, more generous, but there are other solutions. There are also other options on the table. And second, we also have to, you spoke about geopolitics, we also have to bear in mind the geopolitical consequences of that. Depends also on the terms of the peace with Russia and also on the terms of the partnership we want to have with Russia. Is it a wise thing to, this is not very politically correct, but we have to put this question on the table. Is it wise to give a candidate status to Ukraine in the long-term perspective of having stable and peaceful relations with Russia? I mean, look at the situation in Ukraine. You also have, Russian minorities. It's not that the whole country wants to join the EU. You have a majority of the country which is fiercely in favor of the EU, but you also have a part of the country which is not. And we are speaking here about the eastern part of Ukraine. I mean, how can you make them swallow that they will belong to the European Union? I mean, those are geopolitical questions that for which no one has an answer now.
Yeah, that's a very good question. And talking about geopolitics, Slovenia and Poland, and all these Central Eastern European countries did not hesitate in issuing a joint statement urging EU member states to make prompt and brave choices in support of Ukraine joining the EU by 2030, actually. So, as I mentioned, Slovenia's Prime Minister finds Ukraine's fast-track EU membership candidacy a strategic political answer to the current challenges. In your opinion, what would be the benefits and the drawbacks of Ukraine's EU accession for the Central East European members?
Well, the drawbacks mostly will be the reaction of Russia. We don't know. But if Russia is hostile to this move, then it's not going to bring a lot of geopolitical stability to the region. The benefits, as well, is that indeed it will improve also the stability of the neighborhood, in that sense that Ukraine will have to do a lot of massive efforts to Europeanize itself, which means far less corruption, more a better justice system, better economic system, markets. It will also benefit from a lot of EU help, more than what it gets now already. And so it will be maybe one day a decent neighbor, and even maybe one day a fully fledged member states. Who knows? And also bear in mind that the enlargement has always been a debate in the European Union between deepening and widening. And those who would like to go further into the deepening of the European Union, like the so-called more federalists, are not very big fans of enlargement, because they have the impression that the more we are, the shallower we remain. And so for them as well, to enlarge one or even 5 countries in a row to the east will have first geopolitical consequences, but also consequences for the depth of the European integration. And again, a European Union where we will be, 33, 34 member states cannot really, become something proto-federal, if you want. So that's why, let's be realistic. I don't even think that a lot of countries in Western Europe are ready to accept Ukraine or even the others. I mean, let's face it, without the war, the perspective of an enlarged European Union were very, very weak. Maybe Serbia would have joined in the next 5-6 years, maximum. I don't think that any other country would have followed in the next 10 or 20 years. I wouldn't have seen Albania coming, even Macedonia. So now Ukraine, and even more important, because now also Moldavia and Georgia also applied. They also want to become candidate countries. We don't even know whether Georgia is geographically a European country. Actually, it is not. So can we even qualify it as a European country? And also, do you think that's the best way to secure like a stable and relations with Russia in the long term? If basically we even have European countries up to the Caucasus, I don't know. But okay. But again, those questions are very much on the table. Let's not forget about them. Now we're in the heat of the war. Now our moral duty, our geopolitical interest is definitely to bring Ukraine closer to us. But don't forget that there are many ways to do that. You have association agreements, but by the way, Ukraine already have one, and it was signed in 2014 and triggered already revolution, and a lot of people died for that in Ukraine. There are other ways also, to increase this current cooperation. For example, by becoming a candidate country, that can happen. Turkey has been a candidate country for
ages.
And actually now the negotiations are totally, in a stalemate. And actually, I don't think that Turkey will ever join the European Union. Even there, the Turkish population is not in majority in favor for that anymore. So I think it's important now to give a European perspective to Ukraine, but to anticipate that it will soon, maybe in the next 5 years, become an EU member state. That's much more unpredictable. It's actually a very shaky statement to do.
Yeah, so if I understand it correctly, you were referring to the fact that the granting of a European perspective to Ukraine can be considered as a political tool, a diplomatic tool, to strengthen Ukraine's position.
And maybe the best of the compromises in the current situation. Yes, absolutely. I fully understand the political will to do that, and I even support it. But between that and becoming a fully fledged member of the European Union, you have really a couple of planets in between.
I see. But going back to the benefits and drawbacks of a possible EU membership of Ukraine for the Central Eastern European member states, in financial terms and budgetary terms, how would it affect the cohesion policy? Mm-hmm. As Ukraine would become immediately the poorest country with the poorest regions. And, there is this initiative, this Friends of Cohesion Policy group within the European Union fighting and lobbying for further funds during the MFF talks. So their position would weaken, right?
Well, it's true that Ukraine will systematically become the poorest country. It will absorb a lot of European funds. And also they have to improve their capacity to absorb them, because not only one thing it's already difficult to get money, but it's even more complicated to spend it. I think that's also a very important point. On the other hand, I think that wouldn't be the problem number one. Money wouldn't be the problem. Now the European Union, was able to borrow as the European Union itself, in the markets. Again, you also have to consider that if Ukraine joins, it also means that the average will be lowered, and so some other countries, will stop becoming net beneficiaries. And some countries, for example, like the Visegrad, that anyway, whatever would have happened, would have stopped being beneficiaries in the next 5 to 10 years. So I don't think that money would be the problem. I see more the problem from first the geopolitical side. Is it a good idea to do so in order to have a long-standing peace and stable relationship with Russia? And second, most importantly, is Ukraine ready and able to swallow all these reforms? The Copenhagen criteria, which are the criteria for enlargement, are very complicated. Those 35 chapters that are now in clusters are also very complicated to fulfill. And now the way the new negotiating methodology is also very strict, very severe. And so, for example, it can be reversed. If the Commission is not happy about some of the progress, they can basically reopen chapters that were closed a couple of years later. Think about the rule of law. Think about the fight against corruption. Think also about the economic reforms. I mean, it takes a competitive market to join the European Union.
And human rights, state of democracy.
Mm-hmm. And also, for example, the rights of minorities. And so the rights of minorities is an important topic because I don't think that it's taken very seriously in Brussels, to be honest. I think in Brussels, the term minority rather echoes sexual minorities, but not cultural minorities. And so it's really a topic on which the European Union tries, not to be too nosy. So basically, they don't like to intervene in those things. But still, they cannot avoid the elephant in the room. What about Hungarian minorities there who have not been treated very well in the last years? What about also the other elephant in the room, the Russian minorities? We have countries today like Estonia who still have problems with that. Very difficult to solve. I don't have a perfect solution either. But again, those are problems. And Ukraine will also join the European Union with a great deal of problems. Can the EU digest them? That's another question that we have on the table.
Yes, and bearing in mind the basic and very severe accession criteria, and also the experience of the very slowly progressing Balkanic enlargement process. In your opinion, how close or how far Ukraine stands from meeting such requirements?
Very far. Very far. So if one day Ukraine belongs a fully fledged European member state, it will take a long, long time. But again, it might take less time, and it actually might be very realistic to give them already a solid European perspective by becoming a candidate member state, for example. And then, European Union is already like a multi-speed European Union. You have countries that are in Schengen, countries that are not in Schengen, countries that are in the Euro, countries that are not in the Euro. So maybe this is also a good occasion for the European Union to reinvent other categories. We also have, for example, the European economic space, to which Norway, for example, belongs, or Iceland belong. Why not Ukraine, for example? So you see, you have a catalog, a menu of different options on the table. So we should also run from very binary options that, Ukraine is either nothing or European member state. No, you have, again, a lot of options in between. And depending on those options, some can be delivered rather quickly and some rather slowly if they ever happen. I'm still very skeptical of Ukraine becoming an EU member state, but I'm more optimistic about Ukraine becoming definitely, being in the fully fledged, if you want, country in the European sphere of influence. I don't like to use this word because this is the one that Russia normally uses. But yes, I think there is a case there. But don't forget neither that Ukraine has a lot of internal problems to solve once the war will be over.
Yes, and so far we primarily approached the topic from a European point of view. And now let's talk a bit about the Ukrainian perspective. Countries can be admitted to the EU in the future if they have the consent of their citizens, as expressed through approval in their national parliaments or by a referendum. Do you find, for instance, that the EU's Eastern Partnership program that von der Leyen considered to be very relevant and very successful through its development funds and development incentives. So do you find it successful enough to convince the average Ukrainian population that is so divided that their country's future is in the European Union instead of a Eurasian Commonwealth dominated by Russia?
I don't think that now, as we speak, being European is not a matter of funds or trade or Eastern Partnership or whatever. It became really like a civilizational choice for probably the majority of the Ukrainians, but not all of them. And again, let's not forget that we're speaking here about a country that is heavily divided. There's no national cohesion now in Ukraine. You have part of Ukraine, the western parts of Ukraine, that might be the majority that looks to the west, but you also have another part of Ukraine that looks very much to Russia. And that's basically the core of the problem now. That's why, the war they have since the war happened in 2014. So after 8 years of war, Russia made it worse and intervened. But it's not that everything was peaceful until 2 weeks ago. That's absolutely not true. And so the question here is that whether a European perspective on Ukraine is going to divide the country even more. Because it became now really a matter of principles, a civilizational choice from let's say, is the deal that the European Union will offer to Ukraine good enough? Yes, it will be good enough. It's enough billions, enough perspectives, enough free movement of persons. No, that's not the problem. The problem is here, how are the pro-Russian Ukrainians going to react to it? Again, the revolution in 2014 in Ukraine that led to a civil war in some regions at least was triggered by association agreement between the EU and Ukraine. It's because the pro-Russian president refused to sign it in the very last minute that that this revolution was triggered. And so again, this is the level of geopolitical complexity that we are facing. So in the light of that, honestly, whether the deal of the European Union is good or not, well, we don't care. It's good, by the way, but that's really not the issue, I would say.
Western media is reporting nowadays, in headline articles that even the Russian-speaking population of Ukraine stands against the Russian invasion that is currently going on. But if I understood well what you were telling, it doesn't necessarily mean that they imagine the future of Ukraine within the European Union.
Absolutely. At least in 2014, they didn't. And I don't think that it changed drastically. We're speaking here again about a very, very divided country. And also, as I said, it's a civilizational choice. I mean, one part of Ukraine looks more east because they feel closer to Russia, but also from a moral, ethical point of view, if you want. Those things matter. I mean, sometimes joining the West also comes with a deal of very, social policies and what they call identity politics. That's, like it or not, is somehow part of the package. And so how are also going to react the more conservative parts of Ukraine? And again, those who culturally look more at the East. So I said it already, but indeed, we have to be careful with the Ukrainian EU perspective, because it might also further divide the country. This is at least one of the big question marks that we have on the table.
So it also can be counterproductive at the end.
It might be counterproductive for Ukraine to start with, and hence for the stability in the region.
That's why we have to understand them more, from their perspective.
Yeah. And maybe we have to wait a little bit. Yeah.
So we addressed from the European perspective the legal side and the budgetary financial aspects. But there's so much more. First and foremost, the political point of view. After Brexit, the huge COVID crisis, economic recession, and with all the climate goals we want to meet, how do you see, is the EU ready now to integrate new member states at all?
Well, you mentioned two crises that are... Brexit was a crisis, and it is over. The Euro crisis, now it's more or less over. The COVID crisis, maybe it's starting to be over. But the Ukrainian crisis only started. So to begin with, no one can really answer this question, because we don't know whether the ongoing conflict now is going to last weeks or years. We don't know. If not 1 decade, we don't know. We have to be very prudent with that. But it's true. It's a very good question, because what is obvious is that the European Union is in a dire situation. It's very fragile. It's exhausted. It has been basically since 2010 a period of crisis. It was probably the worst decade in the story of the European Union. It's basically a story of crisis. Euro, Brexit, migration, terrorism, COVID, one crisis after the other, and one that was worse than the previous one. And so the EU now is in a dire situation. I also see now a new impulse for the European Union. The way this organization that is so slow, that works with unanimity, at least in the topics related to defense and external policy, the way it reacted within a week against the Russian aggression, that's also a good reason to think that the European Union has more energy and more dynamism than we thought. And those are good news. I'm very happy to see the European Union reacting that way. By the way, showing that there is a common interest. Whenever the 27 member states agree on something and have a common interest, then the EU is really able to react, in a much more agile way. And again, this is a matter of survival for the European Union. they saw a threat, a clear threat, and so this time they really woke up. And so I see it in a better shape than I thought. Still, the European Union should also become even more pragmatic to get rid, for example, of all the internal divisions, to get rid of woke policies, of this woke craziness that is actually very much en vogue in the European Union. And for example, something that is becoming now indispensable is that countries that are really on the first line now, like Poland and Hungary, I mean, we have to stop, undermining the internal cohesion within the European Union for matters that are absolutely futile and absolutely superficial. I'm sorry, but when you have a war with Russia 500 kilometers away from the European Union or even less, it's not the moment, to kill each other and to divide each other with stories about, gender identity in kindergartens. Honestly, when geopolitics knock at your door like that, when history and the dramatic history is really at your doorstep, who cares about gender theories in kindergartens?
Absolutely, it was a tabula rasa on the political agenda.
Yes, and I think we should get rid of that. We should have much more pragmatism. The European Union should stop thinking of itself as a messianic and providential organization, and rather one, and should become one that is here to defend its own survival and also its own interests. I mean, this very naive and virginal mentality made us forget in the European Union that we were totally dependent on the energy of Russia, that we had no weapons whatsoever, that this crisis caught us totally naked. Can we become pragmatic again? We first need a huge unity and a solid unity among member states in order really to tackle the big challenges of the future. In order to get this unity, and this cohesion, we have to stop dividing member states with allegedly common values. And for example, the next important step is to make sure that Poland and Hungary get their recovery funds, the plans the money to which they are entitled on the basis of the recovery funds. For me, it's really beyond my any understanding that those funds are still blocked for God knows what reasons.
Especially now that these countries are fighting in the front line
exactly.
with the
and are welcoming migrants. More refugees than anyone else. So that's also a good occasion to do a little reset and to forget and to really put into perspective the stupid and futile controversies in which the European Union was basically drawing.
History has shown us that crisis situations can make alliances stronger if they survive, and let's hope for the best. Rodrigo, Ballester, thank you very much for sharing your most appreciated views. Your arguments and claims definitely helped us understand better the background and possible outcomes of Kyiv's step. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Nekem is, köszönöm szépen.
Let's hope the war will be over very soon and that the people of Ukraine will be given the chance to return to their normal life. Dear listeners, you have been listening to the MCC podcast on Ukraine's EU accession endeavors. Thank you very much for following us. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you for listening to this MCC podcast episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors, external contributors, and students, check out our knowledge base at corvinus.hu/en.